Hi, just a quick shout out at the top of the episode to Letterboxd user Lucas Thor, one word. He was crazy enough and nice enough to make a list of all the films mentioned on this podcast so far. A link to his list will be in the episode notes. Oh, and he also wanted us to mention Danish film at some point, since we've neglected it so far. So to appease him, I'll just say Lars von Trier is definitely a filmmaker. Alright, enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Man with the Movie podcast. My name is Daniel and I'm joined by my co-host,
Linas.
And today we have a very interesting topic, one that probably most other film podcasts wouldn't really touch with a 10-foot pole. So we're going places that not a lot of people have gone before. What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about one of our favorite subjects, experimental film. Which is a subject that often gets a bit confusing the way it maybe is defined, because I know some people throw filmmakers into experimental film that maybe have just done some experimental things in their filmmaking, like say someone like David Lynch, who's a little bit experimental in his approach, but he's not really an experimental filmmaker. So today we're going to be going pretty hardcore into the deep end and talking about the true avant-garde filmmakers.
Yeah, the term experimental is quite tricky to even define, and it's really like David Lynch. I would probably call, or someone who doesn't see the deeper end of experimental films would probably say he's pretty experimental and surrealist and weird and all this sort of stuff. And I mean, those all terms might be true, I suppose, but I think as we'll talk about experimental film, he doesn't really make the cut as far as what we consider experimental film. So why don't we discuss this term? What is experimental in terms of film? I do have a quote I can start this off with.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll go with the quote, and then I want you to tell me who you think said it. So The quote is, "People talk about experiment and search above all in relation to the avant-garde. But what does it mean? For the work of art carries within it an integral aesthetic and philosophical unity. It is an organism. Can we talk of experiment in relation to the birth of a child? It is senseless and immoral." So who do you think said that? Someone who's not a fan of the label experimental and just calls it senseless and immoral.
I think up until the last part, I was thinking, maybe it could be like Andy Warhol or maybe even Jonas Mekas, but I think that last part gives me Godard vibes.
It's not Godard.
Okay.
I can somewhat see it. It's actually Andrei Tarkovsky who said this.
Yeah. I feel like now that you've said it, I feel like it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and Tarkovsky is interesting. I'll maybe get back to him in a little bit. But it is interesting. He was not a big fan of experimental film. I remember there was a anecdote, I think, of him attending a Brakhage screening with Brakhage in attendance, and Pew was extremely critical of what he was seeing. I forget which Brakhage was being shown to him, but he was like, this just is not at all cinema. This is not. I mean, he hated a lot of cinema, to be fair, so maybe not the best arbiter of this, but it is a difficult term to define, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it is definitely really hard to at the very least draw the line and figure out who simply is maybe experimental in their approach, but doesn't necessarily quite fall into that experimental film bracket. But also in the experimental film bracket itself, there's so many different sort of styles and avenues that people have explored that it's really hard to actually pin down what this thing is exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very messy and loose term. It kind of is something that it's kind of a binary classification, the way that it's used in general. But it's really more of like a sliding scale, wouldn't you say? It's something that anything that is art or is like art house has degrees of experimentation. There might be experimental moments within conventional films, and calling a director experimental is like putting a stamp on their entire work as a whole, where maybe they might have, some conventional films, some experimental films. I mean, we're going to be guilty of using the term experimental in this binary way, but I just want everyone to know that we at least, I don't know, we see the problems with it.
Yeah, definitely. It is a lot like a spectrum, and nobody fully falls into the I guess, utmost right side of the spectrum, and usually people just find themselves at different points of it, including like normal mainstream filmmakers. Like some of them are just maybe on the lower end of the spectrum, but they do have some experimentation in their work as well.
Yeah. So how do you classify experimental films? Is it just based on vibes, or do you have more of a concrete definition?
It kind of is sort of based on vibes a little bit, but also I feel like for the purposes of this episode in particular, I feel like what I classified as experimental film and experimental filmmakers were people who specifically operated in non-narrative films. So a lot of this stuff, like we used the example of David Lynch earlier, he does have a good amount of experimentation in his work, but his stuff is still focused around a story, focused around a narrative structure, and all the people that at least I will be talking about today don't really do that. They've sort of disregarded narrative, or if they use narrative, then they have foregone the traditional narrative structure or approach to it.
Yeah, I also use that definition. I've also thought about, kind of a vibes-based, I guess, definition, which is whether it makes more sense for this filmmaker's work to be seen like in a theater or in a museum.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, definitely, it's not a descriptive definition, really. It's just more of, does the content of this, whatever I'm seeing, kind of feel like it fits to mainstream sensibilities, or is it more for like a museum going type of person? And going back to Tarkovsky, and this is an interesting point, was in Paul Schrader's, I think his book on transcendental style and film, he had this idea of the Tarkovsky ring. So he put a bunch of filmmakers on this kind of a map, kind of I'd have to look up exactly what his definitions were, but his idea of a Tarkovsky ring was basically like Tarkovsky was at the border of what could be screened for a theater-going audience. And then directors outside of that ring were for the, not for the mainstream, just for the kind of more esoteric such. And, it's not exactly experimental versus non-experimental, but I thought it was kind of an interesting similarity. And I don't really agree with all of his placements of directors, but it's an interesting thought that Tarkovsky is kind of that border between what is like a narrative, mainstream, quote unquote, even though Tarkovsky himself is not mainstream, but the idea that this is still digestible in the conventional sense versus like film that is a lot more out there, that kind of exists in its own weird landscape.
That makes a lot of sense. I sort of maybe think of filmmakers sometimes in similar terms when I'm doing some curating, maybe for my friends or recommending a film to someone, and I also almost use like that iceberg approach, and I try to think of, even if I am recommending like a more art house films, I try to think, because even amongst the art house films there are some that are a bit more approachable than others, and I do feel like someone like Tarkovsky, it does make sense that he would be maybe on the latter end of that, particularly if we're talking about a film like The Mirror, which could potentially even be just a straight up experimental film, because that definitely feels like it's on the very edge.
Right. It's interesting that everyone kind of has a different idea of which Tarkovsky is most accessible or where to start with, but I do think Mirror generally falls at the back end of his work in terms of difficulty. But some people still start with Mirror and love it. So I mean,
that's what I did.
Crazy. For me, I was like the second Tarkovsky I saw, and I didn't finish it the first time. So,
Yeah, I want to say, first time I saw it on like the aeroplane. I just pulled it up on my laptop. I watched like 30 minutes. I was like, this is not for the aeroplane. Let me watch something else. I'll finish this later on like a bigger screen or something.
I want to thank you for taking the heat, because I probably was gonna get some amount of, hate for not finishing Mirror. Or I mean, I did eventually watch it, but it definitely was way too young and could not appreciate it the first time. But then you said you saw 30 minutes of it in an airplane, so I think that's the bigger sin, personally.
Oh yeah, I'm known to have like some very questionable airport film picks.
I think I saw a Mekas film while I was stuck in an airport once. So that's definitely not one of my better ones. Okay, so anyways, I think we've talked enough about the term.
Yes.
So we both have a top 10 list of filmmakers. I do have a few observations about my list before we start. Just kind of looking at it overall.
Okay.
I kind of picked filmmakers who are either super slow or like hyper frenetic. So there's really like no in between.
Yeah.
Maybe like one or two, but for the most part, everyone is really slow or really fast.
I think I have a bit more in between, guys. There's definitely some that are very slow and very fast, but also some that are very much just normal pace.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those kind of extremes, at least, appeal to me for whatever reason. And then the other point is like a lot of them don't focus on, they're like not people-centric at all. They're a lot more on landscapes or abstractions.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that says about me as someone who just doesn't want people in their film or something. I don't know. And I guess a last point is they might. This is definitely not an accessibility list, and I would not expect people who are jumping into experimental film for the first time to like a lot of these names. I'll probably point with each name. I do have a list of maybe one or two, I guess, entry points for them. So hopefully they don't completely put people off. But even some of these names, like I have no idea what a good entry point would be, because they're probably just going to alienate a lot of people unless you happen to be weird and enjoy their vibe. So yeah, a lot of difficult names, I would say.
Okay. Shall we get to the list then?
Yeah, since why don't we start with your number 10?
Okay. So at my number 10, I actually probably have one of the more accessible names on this list, although that's kind of saying something. But I went for Bill Gunn. So Bill Gunn was an avant-garde theater director, and he kind of somehow got headhunted during the blaxploitation era. Essentially what happened is Blackula, the blaxploitation Dracula film, had just been made a year or maybe 2 years prior, and it was a massive success, and the studio system was looking for someone to direct another Dracula film starring sort of black talent. And for some reason, they went for an avant-garde theater director, Bill Gunn, and hired him to do this film. Now, I don't know what they were really expecting, but they did not get another Blackula, and what Bill Gunn ended up making was a film called Ganja and Hess. Now, he's made other films, not that many. I think he only ever made 3 films, and most of his work is in theater, but Ganja and Hess is a pretty famous one, because the film is an absolutely sort of mind-boggling vampire film. It draws elements from religion, Christianity, African history, culture, but also subverts, and not even subverts, but sort of just changes elements from vampire films. It's sort of told linearly, but not really. And overall, it's just this really strange but really interesting film, especially from the blaxploitation era, which a lot of the films there were very sort of action-heavy. They prioritized entertainment first, and here came in Bill Gunn and just made this absolutely mind-boggling film. The studio wasn't too happy with the film, so they took it away from him, unfortunately, and kind of tried to recut it into something that has a bit more of a story to it, but they weren't awfully successful. Luckily now the film has been restored, and it is one of like certainly one of the more insane blaxploitation films out there.
Interesting pick. To be honest, Bill Gunn is not, like, I haven't seen any of his films, and I even, before you described his work, I was struggling to even remember what he did. But yeah, Ganjin has, I mean, I've heard lots of very interesting things about. It looks very cool. And he also made this other film called Personal Problems.
Oh, yes.
Which is, I mean, just by the letterbox description, sounds very interesting. It's called an experimental soap opera.
Yeah, yeah. Makes a lot. Like I said, I don't really know what the studio system was expecting when they headhunted an avant-garde theater director, but they got what they asked for, I guess.
That's awesome. I think that should happen more often.
Oh, yeah.
But I definitely should check out his work. Looks very cool.
Mm-hmm.
So for my number 10, I picked someone who didn't do any features at all, actually. He is a Japanese-born filmmaker who's now based in Montreal called Daichi Saito.
Okay.
His style of films it's really kind of, it's not quite Brakhage, but it's somewhat close. It's kind of, he makes films that have like clusters of fleeting images and usually lots of like alternating image and darkness. It's kind of this diametric opposite between sound and silence, image, nothingness. They have, a lot of them have these very frenetic kind of crazy scores as well that are somewhat reminiscent of like Indian music. They just have this sort of free-spiritedness. He works with some of the same musicians in his films. I think Malcolm Goldstein. But yeah, they have it makes these really interesting layers of sound and image. Oftentimes they don't really synchronize. They're just kind of separate tracks. But it's just it makes for an interesting experience overall. I'd say the best, or, again, it's one where I struggle a bit with entry points, but I think his film Trees of Axis, Leaves of Syntax is a good one. It's kind of just images of trees interspersed between darkness, accompanied by, a violin frenetic score, as I was describing. But I think that really underscores, the violin has a very kind of wooden sound, especially in this music. So it really amplifies this visceralness of these trees. So it has this kind of four-dimensional quality, which I find really interesting.
I actually really like images of trees. My favorite Kurt Kren short film is all about sort of just fast images of trees. Kurt Kren did not make my list, but it's definitely someone who I considered amongst the names when I was drafting this list together. But okay, I'll jump to my 9th pick now. And here I have Kenneth Anger. So Kenneth Anger is probably one of the more famous people on my list. He's mostly known from his work such as Lucifer Rising, Scorpio Rising, and he's also the author of the famous book Hollywood Babylon, where essentially he just described a lot of like sort of the Hollywood behind the scenes secrets, open secrets, that sort of thing. And it was a really shocking book at the time. Now, Kenneth Anger, in terms of style, he's probably the first director on my list, at least, who I'd say is really hard to pin down in terms of one style. A lot of these experimental guys, I'd say, in particular, like, spoiler alert, if you're going to go down to the experimental film avenue, you're probably not going to have one singular style that's going to define your entire career. You probably went into it with the intention that you want to experiment and try different stuff. So even if someone like maybe Stan Brakhage, he's known for one particular style, but he has done a ton of different things throughout his career. And the same is kind of true for Kenneth Anger. He had his period where he made a lot of like films focused on the occult, films like Lucifer Rising. He also made these homoerotic films such as Scorpio Rising and Custom Car Commandos that sort of really play into that Marlon Brando from The Wild Ones aesthetic of like bikers looking cool with leather jackets, that sort of thing. It really played up the homoeroticism, but really a lot of his films are just sort of about the mixture of the occult, the cool aesthetic, and this kind of like weird drug-infused point of view.
Yeah, he's a very cool director, and he's been very influential as well. I think guys like Scorsese and John Waters really taken a lot from him. And Scorpio Rising is I think was like a good precursor to the modern music video.
Yeah.
He's... I still haven't seen Lucifer Rising, but that also looks really good. Just a really fascinating guy. Made lots of these occult queer films in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They have a really nice edge to them that, not always.
Yeah, he was definitely someone who was one of the more influential figures in the experimental film movement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. So for my number 9, I also picked, this is definitely the biggest name on my list, and I didn't know where to place him.
Okay.
He's a little known guy called Jean-Luc Godard.
Okay.
He was difficult because, again, this kind of definition of experimental came up a lot. I ultimately put him on the experimental side of the fence, but he made lots of narrative films. That part's undeniable, and he's often a kind of quote unquote mainstream director as well, even though I wouldn't say like they're the easiest films, Breathless and whatnot. The jump cuts are a bit to get used to, but I think if you only look at his 60s stuff, then you kind of do a disservice to Godard's experimentation qualities overall, because he dramatically changes his style throughout his career. I admit I haven't seen any of his 70s work, but they apparently become extremely politically charged. There's this kind of Marxist period, I believe it's called. But then in the 80s, his works just become completely different. Like no real jump cuts anymore. They're just kind of these dedications to the sublime in some ways. I really like his film First Name Carmen, made in the 80s. And large parts of that movie are just Beethoven string quartets playing alongside images of waves on the beach. It's just like, is there a reason? Like, there's a narrative throughout the film, I suppose, but like, is there a reason why there's so much Beethoven and ocean waves other than it's just a sublime combination? Not really, but I love it. And then in the 90s, he becomes this kind of, he's kind of always an essayist, but he becomes even more so. And his Histoire du Cinéma is one of my all-time favorite films, just as just kind of an incredible and impossibly made construction about like the history of film and us as as reflected through film. History as reflected through film. It contains so much, and yet doesn't contain enough in like 4 hours. And then, if this weren't enough, he becomes even increasingly fractured and postmodern in his recent work. I've seen some of his 2010 stuff, and it's a real doozy. Goodbye to Language. I saw in theaters in 3D, and that was. I like the experience overall, but I could not tell you what was happening in that movie. It's so fragmented, and I think that's why I ultimately put Godard on this list. Just because he eventually wraps himself so deeply into this completely esoteric style that it's kind of impossible to ignore. And especially if you've only seen his 60s stuff, it becomes like pretty shocking how much he's changed.
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably don't even notice about Godard. They just think, he made some good films in the 60s and then he just kind of fell off the cliff. But in actuality, just kind of made a decision at one point in time, just got fed up of American cinema copying the French New Wave style, and he just decided to leave it all one day and go down this like insane experimental rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Moving on. The next person on my list is probably the most obscure name on my list. It's a guy called Leighton Pierce. His most known short films are probably films like Sitting, Stone Moss, and He Likes to Chop Down Trees, the spiritual successor to The Man Who Planted Trees, of course. I'd say what's interesting about Leighton Pierce is his most defining characteristic is probably the use of low shutter speed. So for people who don't know, shutter speed essentially determines how fast the shutter of your camera moves. And it impacts a couple things, one of which is how much the light is hitting your sensor. Because if your shutter speed is low, you're not getting as much light into your sensor, and what ends up happening is you get this like imprint of light when you have low shutter speed. And if you move, you get essentially like these motion blur swirly effects of light just remaining on the screen. And he utilized that in pretty much most of his stuff that I have seen. And he was really able to capture the beauty in really simple things just through the use of that one technique.
Interesting. Again, I have not seen any Leighton Pierce films, but from your description, it sounds like something I might really enjoy. And also, just kind of a side note, I do love how we've had no overlap so far. And there definitely won't be overlap with my pick, next one, whom I think I've heard you're not a huge fan of.
Okay.
And I guess just a note to the audience, we originally wanted to do a draft of these guys, but I mean, I think doing it just a top 10 list was a better call, because there's just going to be, I don't know, I'm just trying to guess if you have any others, maybe one or two later on my list.
Can I guess who this
really
person is going to be?
Oh, sure.
Is it Peter Cherkassky? I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yes, it is.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, he's my number 8. He is a very interesting filmmaker to me. He makes these found footage films where he takes like existing footage and he manipulates it through various means. Like he does optical printing and hand processing, and it really makes his films have this kind of disorienting and mesmerizing effect. And it really changes the meaning of the original footage. And that's sort of, this whole remix quality is something I really love in art, where it's like you have an original text and then you can see it in completely new ways. And I guess I should also note on Histoire du Cinéma, that's kind of one reason why I like that movie so much, is it is basically kind of a found footage movie as well. But yeah, as far as Cherkassky's starting points, there's, I don't know, I think there's lots of good ones. Outer Space is his most famous, and it's really interesting how it takes just, I think, clips from this old B movie, and it makes it this kind of existential crisis of like this woman in trouble, and you don't exactly know why she's in trouble or what the exact threat is, but it feels just urgent and universal somehow. And he made other films along the same lines. Instructions for a Light and Sound Machine is this kind of an anti-Western where he takes clips of Leone and completely turns them on its head to make this kind of film that is very critical of the Western and kind of that masculinity, use of weapons, things like that. So again, it's this flipping of original meaning that I really like in his movies.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really know. I feel like he's someone who I should like a lot more than I do, but for some reason I've just not been able to connect with his films when I watched them. But I did watch them like really early in my experimental film journey, so I think I will probably maybe check some of them out again one day. There is one of his films that I did actually enjoy, but it's like one of his like most obscure ones. I think it's called Nocturne, I want to say. It's only like a minute long, but it was maybe a bit more up my alley at the time that I watched it. But speaking of remixing footage, my next person on my list, the number 7, is Bruce Conner. So Bruce Conner sort of operated, he's probably most famous for his sort of 60s output. and films such as Cosmic Ray, Report, a movie. And what Bruce Conner did is slightly similar, where he took footage from news broadcasts, from other films, from different stuff that he could find around, and he kind of spliced it all together in a really chaotic and really fun way. And I'd say Cosmic Ray in particular is up there as like one of my maybe like top 3, top 5 favorite experimental film. It's so much fun. It's only like 5 minutes long, so it's for me it's also would be like the perfect Bruce Conner entry point, and it's really fast paced and really exciting and really engaging. It's like a really massive sensory overload. And I guess I could also point out that in his films, a big focus, due to the time that he made them all in, is on the sort of atomic bomb and state of the world. Like I think Cosmic Ray, I think he made that in 1962. I want to say, I might be wrong on the year, but that's the Cuban Missile Crisis year, and so that whole doomsday element plays a massive role in his films.
Yeah, I love Bruce Conner's films, and he was actually my number 11. I cut him at the very end. So we still don't have an overlapping director, but
okay.
I do like his films a lot. Yeah, I think of all the ones I've seen, I think Report might be my favorite. It's just so visceral in the editing.
Oh yeah.
It kind of has divisive ratings on like Letterboxd, but I think part of it is it's on like a list of like, I don't know, like 1,000 movies to see before you die or something.
Okay.
I don't know. I think it's a bit more exposed to like normal people for some reason. And so they're like, what the hell is this? So speaking of that, my number 7 is Michael Snow. And I was going to start with a video essay the angry video game nerd made on one of his films.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he made a video called The Worst Movie of All Time or something like that. And he featured Michael Snow's Wavelength on that video. And I haven't seen the video actually, but it was interesting at least to see that he has enough exposure to be a bit of a notorious figure in some circles. Wavelength is kind of a notorious film in a lot of ways. I don't know if you've seen Wavelength.
I haven't.
Actually,
no.
What do you know about the film Wavelength? Just off the top of your head.
What do I know about it? I don't think I know it. I'm more familiar with Michael Snow than I am with any singular work of his. Like I've just heard his name floating about, but I've never actually watched any of his films.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because I think Wavelength has a bit of a reputation for being like an endurance test. And there are a lot of people that will say nothing happens in the movie. But to me, it's kind of a film that kind of contains the universe in such a short amount of time. And that's one reason I love his work. And he's a central figure of the structuralist film movement. This is a film movement I really love. I don't think I have any structuralist guys on here, unfortunately. I'll shout some out at the end. But this is a movement that basically made very simplified art and usually predetermined art. The shape of the film was basically determined from the start, and the content is usually kind of peripheral. But like for Wavelength, it's really just a zoom in. Well, I say just, but there's a lot more going on. But that's kind of the essence of the film. It zooms in from one side of a room to the wall on the other side. And then there's even jokes in Wavelength that are like, there's a character that walks in the frame and then dies. And then the camera just zooms right past him. And I love that so much. It's just like it doesn't matter at all. You don't know why he was there, but it's not important. The zoom in is important. That's the only thing that matters in this movie. There's flickers of color. The score is really, it gets crazy. It kind of just, I think it gets louder and it just rises kind of continuously. I don't know. It was one of the real first experimental films that I think I fell in love with. And so for that, I always like Michael Snow. I think as far as entry points, it could be a good one. It'll probably put a lot of people off, but it's definitely his most notorious film. If you want like a shorter dose of Snow, his film Cityscape might be a good one. It's kind of just camera zooming around a city from afar. He did other films where there's more camera movement. So yeah, cityscape could be good as well.
Yeah, I feel like that complaint that you mentioned, like nothing happens, is something that a lot of people have when they maybe check out experimental film for the first time, where they expect there to be one of two things, either some sort of narrative or some sort of story or something happening, or they just expect it to mean something, have some sort of overarching meaning. And a lot of these films just don't have either of those two things. Like, they just kind of exist as this really just pretty thing to immerse yourself into, explore, experience, and then leave having seen something that you've never seen before. Okay, that out the way, let's jump to my number 6. This was a bit tricky, because I when I started making this list, I thought this person would definitely be in my top 5. But the more I thought about it, the more I think I really like some of his films, but there are also some that I just could not care less about. And this person is Teo Hernandez. And no, it's not the footballer. So, okay. Teo Hernandez is probably most famous from short films such as Léo de la Seine, Our Lady of Paris, and also the feature Salome. And he's probably also the hardest person to pin down on my entire list. Whereas a lot of these experimental filmmakers sort of like have these different eras where they do different things in them, Teo Hernandez has so many different eras from the stuff that he made while he was still back overseas. This like crazy sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, spiritual with a focus on the human body, kind of like images that have a focus on a particular color scheme, to then moving to Europe and the films that he made in France, such as Léo de la Seine, which use like a very fast speed and they're really frenetic and a lot of stuff is happening, and there's a use of that similar motion blur as Leighton Pierce uses, but whereas he really slowed it down, Teo Hernandez really speeds it up, and there's everything just going super spad at a crazy fast speed. And some of Teo Hernandez's films I liked in particular. One of his earlier ones that's really stuck out to my mind is Louf de Egret, where it's just the song Quizás, Quizás, Quizás playing over a guy in... Oh, do I remember it well enough to describe it? It's a guy in drag, dressing up or undressing. I don't remember exactly what it is, while the song plays, and it's like sped up footage, and I really like just the look and feel of that short film. But also from his stuff that he made over in Europe, I really like Léo de la Seine. That again is one of my all-time favorite experimental films, and I just thought it's really beautiful since the first time I saw it.
We finally have an overlap in our list. Yeah, Teo Hernandez is on my list as well. I'll probably talk a little bit more about him when we get to him there.
Okay.
So yeah, I got to see that Aloof film. Actually, I haven't seen that one, but that sounds really cool. My number 6 is Jordan Belson, and he's probably the most accessible name on this list. In fact, had good luck actually, introducing his work to other people. Whereas I don't think I could really say the same of the others so far. And these are people not necessarily even some into experimental film, I guess some less so. But yeah. he's probably also, I think one reason for that is he doesn't fall in this, what I said at the front, which was like either super slow or super frenetic. His films are really, they're like a lot of intricate patterns and vibrant colors, and it's paced really kind of beautifully. And a lot of them are accompanied with music, some classical, some like electronic, and a bit more. Some of them haven't aged as well because he was making films in like the 50s, 60s.
Yeah. And,
the effects and some of the things back then were, they're less good than they are today. But, regardless, those ones are still interesting relics of the time, whereas his stuff that has aged incredibly well are, I think some of his, some really beautiful films. Like, I think Fountain of Dreams is just so beautiful. It's a cosmic film that's kind of set to Franz Liszt music, and it's just it's very magisterial. It's just very much just a look at, again, the universe. I like films that can, I mean, this one kind of is more literal in that sense, but I do like films that can inspire the sense of something greater that exists beyond the film, something cosmic or universal. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, like, he has many great entry points.
Yeah.
I really just, you didn't make a whole lot, and all of them are pretty short, so you could just spend like a couple hours watching all his films, and that'd be a great day. So yeah.
I was really close to putting Jordan Belson on my list. He would have been like 12th or 13th name if we would have gone for even more people. So he just barely missed out. Funny story though. I remember I was watching Jordan Belson short. I can't remember which one it is. Back home in Lithuania at my parents' place, and I was just watching it on the telly when my parents came back home. And my mom actually heard the music in one of his short films, and then later was like, "Oh, where was that music from? It sounded like really beautiful." And then I showed her some of his films, and she really liked them.
That's awesome.
And she's not even into film, let alone experimental film. So that was really, really strange.
Yeah, that's a great endorsement.
Yeah, but now getting into the top 5. So 5th name. So again, I was really between Teo Hernandez and this person, which one of these makes it into my top 5. But eventually I settled on this person just because I think I know what I get from him more consistently, and I more consistently have enjoyed his work than Teo Hernandez's. And this person is Jonas Mekas, the godfather of avant-garde cinema. So, as some people know, I'm Lithuanian, and Jonas Mekas is also Lithuanian, but funnily enough, nobody in Lithuania actually knows that he's a filmmaker. We actually get taught about him in school, and he's even part of our literature exam, but he's part of it as a poet. Everyone knows his poetry, nobody knows his filmmaking back home, which is like really strange, because he's definitely the most famous and prolific Lithuanian filmmaker of all time, but nobody's just aware of that. But yeah, Jonas Mekas, for those unfamiliar, he's probably most famous for the diary film. What he would do in a lot of his films, he would sort of talk to the audience and either narrate his experience or his internal introspective or sometimes very poetic thoughts. And he used, as he himself described it, editing to make life more exciting. Like the famous example would be his circus segment from Diaries, Notes, and Sketches, where he famously told the story that he showed this segment to someone and they said that it's better than actually going to the circus. That's how he sort of was able to splice the experience of going to the circus in that kind of way. And yeah, he definitely put a lot of emphasis on the editing in a lot of his other films as well. Like some of the more famous works of his are As I Was Moving Ahead, Occasionally I Saw Brief Glimpses of Beauty. Probably not the best entry point because it's like 5 hours long, but he also made films such as Diaries, Notes and Sketches, and Reminiscences of a Journey to Lithuania. And I think actually, despite the fact that Diaries, Notes and Sketches is 3 hours long, it's a pretty good starting point because Jonas Mekas, you can definitely enjoy him in more bite-sized pieces, and I almost get the sense that that's how he intended his work to be taken, that you almost like watch it in parts as like different pages of a diary. That's why a film like Diaries, Notes and Sketches is even split into different sort of parts, I guess, and you really get just like a sense of where he was at a certain point in time as you engage with that portion of the film.
Yeah, I might describe Mekas as like the original vlogger.
Yeah.
He was kind of the first person to make these diary films, I believe. And I did discuss diary films a little bit in episode 2, I want to say.
Yes.
And that was, one of my favorite, I guess, subgenre discoveries as of last year. So Mekas is like the godfather of that. And, his films are quite as much like an actual diary in film form as you can get. So
for people who are also really into experimental films, a lot of the figures that we talk about actually appear on his films because he was friends with all of them. So like you'll see Stan Brakhage in some of his work. You'll see Andy Warhol in some of his films. Yeah,
he was a big person in the American, the Filmmakers Cooperative, which is a co-op of a lot of those filmmakers in the 60s. and they basically all supported each other making weird independent films. When Mekas eventually came to America, so I think that's part of it. And I guess I'll end with this. I went to a screening of Blonde Cobra and Flaming Creatures. These are two pretty notorious experimental films in the 60s that neither of which were made by Mekas, but Mekas was the kind of main person programming them and supporting them. And I think both of them, but maybe Blonde Cobra in particular, were very controversial for and they got subsequently, I think, banned because it was seen as like pornographic, and then Mekas and I think others got arrested for that screening, and then they actually had to go into court. Believe they beat the charges. I kind of forget the end of the story, but it was just like,
beat
damn,
the pornography allegations. Oh my god.
Yeah. No, I saw the movies are not pornographic. People are just pearl clutching back then. Anyways.
Yeah.
So very interesting guy. My number 5 is actually Teo Hernandez.
Okay. So,
yeah, you already said a lot of good things about him. He changed his style dramatically. His 70s work, I haven't seen a lot of, but he was apparently a lot more focused on the human body.
Oh,
he
yes.
made these very corporeal films. And he made like a tetralogy on the human body. But you can even see through those 4 films that his style, like he changed from like static camera images to basically shaking the entire camera every which way. So yeah, he became progressively faster, more disorienting. I love his film Maya from 1979. It had the interesting thing, I'll talk more about this with other filmmakers, but a lot of these filmmakers were inhibited by distribution of their films. A lot of them are not available to see and weren't for a while. I think Hernandez has had a bit of a recent revival because films like Maya and those other features, I want to say they're more available recently because I'd heard of them, but only like very few had seen them on like Letterboxd, and didn't, no one could really know where to find them. But I think they eventually all ended up online somehow. They still lack, I think, like a physical release or anything like a official distribution. So a bit unfortunate. But yeah, love some of his work. I haven't seen a whole ton of it, but Maya and his short film Our Lady of Paris is really incredible. Just kind of a really intense look at the Notre Dame Cathedral, I believe, and just its geometric properties, and its soundtrack is really this kind of crazy intermixing of religious music, like prayer and kind of crazy electronics. Great stuff.
Okay. So moving on, at number 4 on my list, I actually have a very, very contemporary filmmaker, and that's Scott Barley. So Scott Barley is most famous for making these experimental films on his iPhone out in the wilderness. A lot of his films sort of focus on shooting nature and mixing that with a sort of cosmic horror element. Not necessarily cosmic, but it does sort of involve the horror that is maybe naturally found in nature. And that's part of what I really like about his films. He really plays into this aspect of the unknown, the idea that the scariest thing in the world are those things that we don't understand and don't know anything about. And he really manages to find and isolate those elements in nature. And that's one element that definitely really attracted me to his films when I first watched them. What's interesting is he also is, I think, the only filmmaker on my list who actually recommends a way to watch his films. Like, all of his films start with him essentially saying that you should watch this with good headphones in complete darkness to get the most out of your experience. And I have definitely found that sort of elevates a certain aspect of his films, which is the ability to almost like transport you into a different world, which is something that I really like about experimental film in particular. Like, it certainly has an ability to just transfer you to some places you've never been to before. Another filmmaker who maybe has similar quality from what I've seen is a guy called Nathaniel Dorsky, who also has like this very transportative quality in a film that I've seen from him called Alea, I think the name is.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Scott really leans into that, and the way he shoots nature is really beautiful, and I've always really just enjoyed looking at the images that he's captured. They're all like some Renaissance paintings. They're just really, really stunning. And he was actually the first experimental filmmaker that I've ever watched. I've somehow discovered his feature film Sleep Has Her House. Then I've watched a bunch of his short films, and that's what sort of led into me watching some of Jonas Mekas stuff, Stan Brakhage, etc., etc.
Yeah, I don't have him on here, but I do really love Sleep Has Her House. I think it's such an apocalyptic vision of the world without even showcasing anything. It's a film that only has shots of nature, and yet you feel like the whole world is ending. It's crazy how he can conjure that idea and effect. And I want to say there's only like 5 shots in that movie or something like that.
Something about that, yeah.
Yeah, I think the first shot takes like 15 or 20 minutes. It's really long, but it's so mesmerizing.
Yeah, it is. I was just going to say, it isn't just a static shot. It is like a constant zoom out that sort of reveals more and more of the image. But it is really, really pretty. And for people who don't want to watch the whole feature, he has also some really good short films, like Hinterlands is one that stands out in my mind as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's a good point about the moving shot. I was just going to say his Letterboxd is a great resource as well for people who like... my tastes kind of actually is pretty similar to Scott Barley's, so it's been very useful to me. His favorites list has had I've had some really incredible discoveries from that. So shout out to directors who use Letterboxd and aren't afraid of it. I'd probably be terrified if I were famous using Letterboxd. Okay, so my number 4, we're on 4, I believe.
Yes.
Is he's pretty an esoteric name, Jean-Claude Rousseau.
Ooh.
Yeah, so he's... I forgot to mention with Hernandez, he was a big progenitor. He was a big user of Super 8 cinema, and Jean-Claude Rousseau is as well. This is just like 8mm handheld camera, and I don't think that it captures any audio. It's just video. So what Rousseau's films, this is the guy I've had the most difficulty describing his work, especially that I've seen 2 features of his, and I think he has more, but The Antiquities of Rome and The Enclosed Valley are 2 of my all-time favorite films, and they're both really difficult to describe. They both utilize landscape as kind of a character, developing landscapes as one would develop character. They reappear throughout the films with either different perspectives, different lighting, as one would develop characters in a movie. Antiquities of Rome is kind of like an anti-travelogue. It's about Rome in a sense, but it's also about how dirty and congested Rome is, even though it has like stunning works of the old world, and how also like traveling, you're just spending a lot of your time in a hotel room. So it's really anti-romantic, de-romanticizing the aspect of traveling and whatnot. Enclosed Valley is a bit different, but I feel like I can't even really describe it that well in such a succinct manner, but it's kind of like a post-structuralist film. Again, utilizing landscape. People are also in these movies, but it's really the focus is locations, and I feel like I need a lot more time to work on my Rousseau descriptions, but his ideas are very complex, and I'm still wrapping my head around both of these movies, so would highly recommend. I don't know what a good entry point is, but I guess I think his earlier works probably. I haven't seen much of his later stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I was very close to putting him on my list as well. He, again, would be like the 11th or 12th name. I haven't seen his feature films, but I've seen a number of his short films, and I remember in particular Venesi N'existe Pas and Senza Mostra, I think it was called. Mm-hmm. 2 short films, both about 10 minutes long, and they are a bit, like you sort of mentioned, they're more focused almost like on the landscape and showing off these different parts of the world. But I do really like the way that he shot them, and they have like this almost like a melancholic quality to it that I really like. It's just interesting. It's an interesting atmosphere to sit in for me.
Mm-hmm. I should also mention his films are very slow. So
oh yes,
definitely difficult. Long takes. Definitely would be accused of nothing happening in his movies if he were more well known. But yeah, impossible to describe. Anyways, who's your number 3?
Speaking of nothing happening, the next director that I have on my list is someone who has a shit ton of things happening. I was actually really surprised that he ended up as high on my list as he did, but I ended up doing my list based off personal enjoyment, rather than like trying to think of some like insane objective criteria that would overlap over all of these films. And I just found that on personal enjoyment, I just have a ton of fun watching his stuff, and this filmmaker is Takashi Ito. So he, again, is someone who had a few different styles, but the period of time that I love the most from him is his 80s output, and in particular the 3 films Thunder, Grimm, and Ghost. All 3 of them have this like very ominous, all-encompassing, enveloping atmosphere. And what really stands out about them is the way he uses movement and navigates a space, sometimes a really tight space, and just gets a ton out of it. Incredibly creative. Hits on that same sort of ability of being able to transport you to a different space and time, except the spaces that he transports to, they're just completely out of this world entirely, and it's a really insane sensory overload experience. Somewhat similar to Bruce Conner, whereas Bruce Conner focused more on editing, Takashi Ito really focuses on movement and the atmosphere.
Yeah, I've always wondered how he makes his movies. He's a very fascinating filmmaker, but I want to say it's like a mixture of like long exposure and I don't know, because it like mixes what looks like a sped up movie, but also with things that are occurring in like normal time, which is really interesting to me. So yeah, I do like his stuff as well. He's not on my list. I was actually thinking you were going to say my number 3 because he's also on the frenetic side.
Okay.
And that man is Stan Brakhage.
Okay.
So, yeah. I mean, I think I've said Brakhage's name in the first episode. So maybe not surprising to people who've listened closely or know me, but I love Stan Brakhage's films. He's also someone who's, maybe by reputation he makes frenetic films, and maybe that is, yes, a big part of his filmography, rapid editing, usage of hand-painted frames. But he also does a lot more. He incorporates, live action like footage. He's done actually quite a few slower films, which might surprise some people. Both, I guess they're a bit more early in his filmography, but I think my favorite of all of his films is the short Commingled Containers, which is, I'd say, on the slower side for Brakhage. There are some moments that it's basically just like close-ups of water with a few of his hand-painted frames, kind of a signature thing thrown in, but it's just so mesmerizing. You see how light interacts with water, and it's kind of a cheat code for a lot of experimental films for me, but he does it in such close-up that it's kind of this impossible level of detail that is beautiful and makes you look at, I think, the world in a bit of a different way, at least for me. But yeah, he's made lots of interesting stuff. I think his famous short, like Mothlight, is just a collection of moth detritus, like wings, parts of moths just taped to frames and like fed through a camera for like a few minutes. So quite interesting stuff. Again, very different from his like hand painted stuff, but has that signature frenetic editing that I think, you know, is a through line to a lot of his films. So what do you think of Brakhage?
Well, we found the second overlap on our list because Stan Brakhage is actually my number 2.
Oh, so, nice. Good segue.
Yeah, I'm also a big fan of Stan Brakhage. I haven't seen as much of his stuff as you have, but the stuff that I have seen, I've loved pretty much all of it. Like similar to Mekas, the stuff that I have seen just has like a certain consistency of quality to it. And I'm a big fan in particular of the Dante Quartet, and probably my favorite one from him is either that or Black Ice, which was sort of like inspired by a personal bad accident that he had where he fell on some ice and then needed to get eye surgery. It's like a slightly more like ominous and darker take on the traditional Brakhage style, which is actually really difficult to describe. Like you hear Daniel say hand painted, but I feel like if you've never seen anything by Stan Brakhage and you hear that, the idea in your head will not be what his films actually look like. The interesting thing that he did is he painted directly onto the celluloid to create his films, and they're just really, really beautiful, really striking, really pretty to look at. And I think he's also, I'd say, probably the most accessible name on this list. Like, at least you can get a very sort of, I shouldn't say maybe all of his stuff, but some of his stuff, the more hand-painted things, because you can at the very least get like a very fast, quick injection of it and just get a taster of whether you enjoy something within it or not. Because there's films like The Eye Myth, which is under 1 minute long, and it's up on YouTube. It's easy to find, and you can check it out and very, very quickly tell whether this is something for you or not. And he has other short stuff like Stellar, really popular. Again, it's only like 2 minutes long. Black Ice is only 3 minutes, and he has a good variety of styles if you get sort of tired of the hand-painted stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of agree. You said he was accessible, and for a moment I had to think about it, but I think I'd actually agree. And I think the reason is his films are not intellectual like I think a lot of other films we've talked about are.
Yeah.
They're really just beautiful. They're just like, they appeal to the sense of beauty. So, you know, it's kind of something that you'll either just love or not like. But I don't think you're like missing any, I don't know, bigger concepts with his movies. To me at least. So yeah, I think as far as, good films of his to watch, the ones you mentioned are great. I do love Black Ice, Dante Quartet. I think I would personally save Dog Star Man till later. I think longer form Brakhage is a little harder. It was at least for me. But once you like his style, then kind of just go wherever you want. I don't know.
Yeah.
Great. I think you will not have my last two names, so I think we will stand at two overlapping names. My second in my top 10 is Franco Piavoli.
Okay. Wow. Someone I've never even heard of. Okay.
Great. He's an Italian filmmaker. And whereas most of the other films I've described in my list are all short films, Piavoli, at least the ones I've seen, are features. So he is probably aside from Godard, the only filmmaker on my list who's more known for feature work. But again, as I said at the front, I like, I guess, films that are focused more on landscapes and just kind of devoid of people. And that's kind of a good description of Piavoli's work. A lot of his films are virtually like free of dialogue. And the ones that do have dialogue, like Nostos, The Return, there are no subtitles for the dialogue. So it's kind of a made-up language, actually. So it's interesting. It's really, the humans are just kind of cameos. I read that description, and it really stuck with me. Someone wrote about Piavoli's work, where the humans are really just cameo appearances in his movies. The real focus is nature, and he has lots of interesting editing techniques as well. I think something like The Blue Planet was my first. Actually, it might have been my second Piavoli, but Nostos and The Blue Planet are just some of the most beautiful films. Really, all of his features are the way they capture nature, the way that they see things, landscapes, water. It's hard to describe, again, why it's so beautiful. You just kind of have to see them.
Yeah.
But there's like details you just can't see otherwise that he captures. He's able to like magnify them and take them to this other realm like entirely. The other thing with Nostos is it's ostensibly an adaptation of the Odyssey.
Okay. Bloody hell.
Exactly. It's a very kind of loose one where the characters, again, they speak kind of a made-up language, and it's really just the focus is on the, I guess, nature, on the kind of impressionistic ideas and feelings of what a journey is like. Again, it could be tough if you're expecting like an Odyssey adaptation. But again, I think all of his films could make for good starting points, his features. Just highly recommend Franco Piavoli's stuff.
Okay, that actually sounds like like it would be right up my alley. As I mentioned with Scott Barley, I do really like just looking at beautiful shots of nature. So I think I'll maybe check him out after this episode, because like I said, I've never even heard of this person up until now.
Great. All right, big number ones. Well, before we do number ones, do you want to talk about honorable mentions?
Yes, I'm going to quickly run through a couple honorable mentions, maybe touch upon some of the more interesting ones. I'd say maybe this will be the same for you, but I can probably split them up into two categories. One that is definitely experimental directors, but I just didn't connect with them as much as some of these other people. So as I mentioned previously, Jean-Claude Rousseau just barely missed out. Claudio Caldini, Kurt Kren, and Nathaniel Dorsky, Phil Solomon, some of the other names, Jordan Belson as well, that have finished just outside of my top 10. I guess Hiroshi Yamazaki as well, even though I've only seen one short film by him called Heliography, but that is one of my all-time favorite experimental short films as well. I guess another name I could also mention would be Maya Deren, which is like a big influential figure. But actually watching Maya Deren's film was like an interesting realization for me of just how important for me sound is in some films. Because that was like the big thing that I really struggled to get over while watching her stuff. Because it's not unlike silent films where you still have sort of like music playing and there's, sound effects and everything. Her films are like completely silent. There's no audio whatsoever, and that was something I kind of struggled to get over when I checked out her stuff. But she's definitely an influential figure, especially with that whole focus on the identity and the subconsciousness sort of shown through the experimentation on film. That's definitely that you can see how that inspires some people like Kenneth Anger in the future. But yeah, there's another sort of group of filmmakers who also didn't make the list. They were just on the cusp, but I sort of in the end decided they weren't experimental enough, or they maybe had a bit too much narrative in their films. And actually, a lot of these filmmakers, interestingly enough, are animators. So I've considered someone like Jan Schwankmajer when making this list, because his short films in particular, they're both experimental in animation style, and some of them have no narrative whatsoever. But I feel like the output he's more well known for is like strictly narrative work, even though it uses some experimental animation. But I've also considered people like Yuri Norstein, the Russian animated filmmaker who also made stop motion films. I considered Frederick Bach. I've also considered Marcel Jankovic, the Hungarian animator, who I think has pretty pretty experimental approach to animation, but again, I feel like his films just focus too much on narrative to really make the cut for this list. So those are my honorable mentions, and my actual number one is Raul Ruiz, who I feel like is not a surprise to anyone who knows my taste in film, because I talk about him all the time. What's interesting about Ruiz is that he kind of made narrative films, but what's interesting about him is that he very publicly rejected narrative theory, which is that films are supposed to be made centered around a narrative that's meant to sort of like appeal and engage an audience, and he instead sort of just used that as a basis for the film and really pushed the experimentation with the film form itself and heavily utilized the film text. He invented his own poetic devices that can be used in film to express certain things, and that included techniques like using the split diopter, the dolly zoom, etc. And he's in a very different lane to, I feel like, some of the other names on my list. Like the most similar person on my list to him would probably be Bill Gunn, because he also sort of operated with kind of like the fringes of narrative filmmaking. But the way he creates films and the way he sort of plays with narrative in a very untraditional way, and the way he utilizes the film form, it just kind of makes you feel like the rest of the filmmakers are only using like the 3% of film's total potential. He's super creative, super fun to watch.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I'm not surprised. Ruiz is your number one. I was unsure whether he'd qualify for, again, we're getting back to what does experimental mean? Because I think I'd agree. Yeah, his style it's on the border of narrative cinema. It's like right on the edge, at least for me.
Yeah.
Where there kind of is narrative, but it's not at all traditional, and it's really just informed more by like dream logic and nothing of like, storytelling that you might know of. So, I definitely could see why someone would include him. I just didn't think about him enough for that experimental random definition that I had. So,
I think he has also made some, because obviously his feature-length films do use more narrative elements, whereas they do have some sort of story. It's just not necessarily a traditional story that follows the narrative theory and is structured like a story, and it is used for the purposes that story is normally used. But he has made also some short films which are like, I'd say, a lot more heavily leaning into the experimental side of things as well. So films like Dog's Dialogue and The Film to Come, which are just almost like quite heavily traditionally experimental films, almost, I'd say.
Yeah, Dog's Dialogue is kind of like an even more radical, like La Jetée. Speaking of, I had Marker as a possible inclusion. I guess going through some honorable mentions, he's someone I haven't seen enough of, but if I had seen more, maybe I'd include him. But I do love Sans Soleil and La Jetée. Other names that I just haven't seen enough of, but have loved what I've seen, include Marlon Riggs, Derek Jarman, both of whom I've only really seen one feature from. Same with Marguerite Duras. Casting Taylor and Paravel are an interesting documentary filmmaking pair. They made Leviathan most notably, and that's one of my favorite films. They do this kind of like hyper-realistic, up-close look at whatever their subjects are. So that was a fishing documentary, and they made one on surgery, I think 2 years ago now. So that one's pretty interesting as well. Bill Morrison, another guy who he does a found footage remakes of, and kind of basically makes them look like lost films in a way, or like decaying films. Love his stuff. Peter Hutton, another landscape guy. Sharunas Bartas. I did think ultimately qualified, but I've only seen a couple films from him.
Yeah.
And Alexander Larose, if I'm saying his name right, who did these really interesting, again, hard to describe, but like hyper realistic, kind of unreal, just depictions of a patch of nature, flowers, trees, stuff that it looks like lots of frames just like colliding at the same time. But it has this really mesmerizing effect, like you're on LSD, walking through a meadow or something. So, yeah, lots of other guys. Again, there's a huge list of names that I could go through. I guess shout out to a few that I cut, whom I have seen enough of, but just didn't like as much, like Hollis Frampton, Kenneth Anger, Maya Deren, Takashi Ito were names you've already talked about. Scott Barley as well. Yeah, and then I won't even get into all the people I couldn't qualify based on the term experimental. I think I've drawn this out long enough.
Okay.
My number one is Nathaniel Dorsky, whom you actually mentioned.
I did, yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's a really personal thing. Brakhage, I think, like, could be my number one if just combining how singular his films are. But really just personal preference. I slightly prefer Dorsky's films. It's a little hard to say why he's my favorite, but his films are very lyrical, very meditative. They explore kind of the beauty of the everyday world. He focuses on just like light and rhythm, the very subtle perceptions of things. All of his films are silent, which could be a problem for some. And they're also, again, getting into the accessibility problem. A lot of them, actually, like most of his films, are not available to see. So I think only like 10 shorts of his are floating around the internet. He's a huge stickler for having his films be seen on film and not digitized. So unfortunate for people that want to see his films. I guess you have to see them basically in theaters if you want to. So, I mean, I've only really seen the ones floating out there. Apologies to Mr. Dorsky to violating his code.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've heard they're great when viewed on film because they're like projected at a slower frame rate than normal. So they have this really kind of sublime quality. I read a bit about him more in his book, Devotional Cinema. Quite an interesting read. So he talks a lot about his philosophy on film and where it came from. But yeah, I think the ones I like most are Alaya, which is the one you mentioned, and Threnody. Alaya is kind of this, it's a look at Earth perhaps, or maybe it's not Earth, but it's a very cosmic film. You see lots of shots of like sand or it's hard to tell. It's very otherworldly, lots of great use of color. It kind of questions how big the world really is, the universe really is. You see shots of stars, shots of sand, both of which are like, if you think about it, like just little, there's so many like grains of sand, in a desert as there are like stars in the sky and the universe. So it's just incredible stuff. Threnody I also love. It's this really sorrowful film. Again, it does the storytelling kind of similar to Scott Barley, I should say, just with a few shots, but they're all just so tinged with sorrow. Maybe it's the name also playing some contextualizing trick on me as well, but they're really just like a film for someone who passed away, the use of light and shadow. It's really powerful. So love his stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I haven't seen that much from him, but from what I have seen, he definitely really heavily hits on that, at least for me, that quality of that I mentioned with Scott Barley of almost like transporting you to a different place, a different reality, even though Alea technically just shows sand, but it looks like some different planet somewhere out there in the universe, just the way it's filmed and presented. It's really like striking imagery, but definitely someone who's a bit more slower in his approach than some of the other people here. Yeah,
agreed. Okay. So that was quite an exercise.
Oh yeah. Who would have known, but talking about films that are borderline impossible to describe would be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. And the ones I like most, I guess, are even the hardest to describe. So who knows?
Because it's really difficult to explain why you like some of these films as well. Because some of them just kind of look pretty. Like something about them just pulls you in. Something about them just fits your sensibilities of the things you like, and you just like kind of just staring at the pretty images. It's almost like trying to, I don't know, just seeing a random painting in the street and then trying to explain why you like that painting. Or maybe an actual better example than a painting would just be like seeing just an image as you're walking about somewhere in the wilderness, just noticing something that looks pretty for some reason, like a sunset or whatever else it may be, and something just strikes something within you, but you can't really explain what it is exactly.
Yeah, I think that's well said. It's just there's something aesthetically beautiful with a lot of these, maybe even all of these films that, again, touches on that kind of like, I think the things that are really core to what it means to be human and appreciate these things are just difficult to describe. It's kind of like describing why things are funny. Yeah. It's like, I don't know. Yeah. It just is.
And I guess if you're someone who doesn't care about or doesn't watch experimental films, but you've made it this far into the podcast and now you feel like you'd like to check some of them out, all I would say is just try go into it with that same mindset. Don't look for this like sort of objective quality in them. Just see what connects with you. And if something feels too slow or you don't have the patience for it or it doesn't connect with you or doesn't grab your interest for whatever reason, don't feel bad about just saying, okay, this person isn't for me. There's so much different stuff out there, like even in our list, like there's some really frenetic fast stuff, there's some slower stuff, there's some that focuses on people, some that focuses on nature, some that's like a diary film, etc. Like the possibilities in experimental film are truly limitless. And if you do sort of go down that route and try to explore it, I think you're bound to find at least one person who just connects with you for whatever reason and you really, really like their stuff.
Yes, and all those people are my list, so check them all out. So, yeah.
I think we can transition now to a quick little segment. So at the end of the episode 2, we played a little game where we graded a bunch of film posters, and today I prepared a different game for you, Daniel.
Oh boy.
I've come up with a director, and I need you to try and guess what director I have in mind with 10 questions or less. Now, I should say, I tested out whether this is actually possible in 10 questions and let ChatGPT do the guessing, and it got the correct answer in 13 questions. So the machines have set a bar that you have to beat now, and if you don't, it's bad news for humanity.
Yeah, I mentioned in our chat that you're starting to act a lot more like Jigsaw. And, I'm worried for what will happen if I can't beat this challenge. But,
yeah, all I'm gonna say is you better.
Okay. All right. So it's good you did this at the end because my brain is kind of fried after going through all these directors. So good chance I won't. Okay. So first question.
Okay.
Is this director European?
He is.
You already told me crucial info.
True. That's true. Yeah.
Okay. So a male European.
nailed two bits of information in one question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So question 2. Has this director were they born after 1960?
To 1960. No, they were born before 1960.
Born before 1960. Okay. Question 3.
Okay.
I wonder if I should start going with not logical questions, but just
okay, just immediately throwing it out there.
Yeah, just stuff based on vibes. Let's see. Okay. Has this director directed a film that has won the Palme d'Or?
Oh my god. Do I know this information? I have to Google this. Okay, hold on.
I don't know if this helps me at all, but I wanted to make you work.
My instinct was that he hasn't, but I'll double check. Apparently he has.
Oh, wow. Okay, time to look at the Palme d'Or winners.
And it's a film of his that I have not heard of before, so that's interesting.
Oh, wow, this is all crucial info. Okay. How many questions was that? 3?
Is that the third or the fourth one? No, that was the third one, yeah.
European, born before 1960, Palme d'Or winner.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you to look at my top 100 films, because I'm going to ask if one of their films is on that list.
Okay, let me find your top 100 films.
I got to make you work. This is my revenge.
My instinct is again that it's not, but I know you have seen films from this person.
Oh man,
this list?
So much information that you just pour on.
Oh, yes.
A simple yes or no would have been
okay.
so
let's
much
see.
more limiting.
Don't see any of his films. What's that? Okay, no, that's not by him.
Okay.
I hope I just don't miss his film on this list as I'm going through it. I'm kind of going through it quickly.
Gives me time to think of the next question.
Okay. I don't think so. I don't see any of his films on here.
Okay. Is this director... This is question 5. Is this director... Let's see. Like, would a first-year film student have heard of this director?
Yes.
Okay. Does this director have a beard?
Oh my god.
Is he known for a beard? I need to know.
No, I would say so, no. He's more known for being clean-shaven, I'd say, actually.
Clean-shaven. Okay, good info.
I'll say later in life he did have a mustache.
Oh, even more info.
Mm-hmm.
Had a mustache. Okay, give me like 10 minutes to look at directors later in life.
Who grew a mustache later in life?
Yeah. Okay. Have we mentioned this director on the podcast, to your knowledge?
I'm pretty sure we actually haven't.
We haven't. Oh, interesting.
Which is a big hint, because we did go through a lot of directors in the last episode. We may have mentioned Tim, but I can't recall.
Okay, so either like in passing or not at all.
Yeah, it would have been like a mention in passing. We didn't go to depth on this person at any point in time.
Okay, I should probably ask some better questions now, because I only have a few left.
I'd say try nailing down the location. That would definitely help.
Yeah, I was thinking of asking about specific countries. Let's see. Would you classify this director... let me see how to best phrase this. Would you say this director is from Western Europe?
Yes.
Okay. Western Europe. Oh god,
Curious.
I'm running out of questions.
Who are you thinking of so far? Like, where's your head at the moment?
Oh, there's a lot of people like I have not narrowed this down much at all. But I'm looking at the Palme d'Or winner list. So
Okay. That was a good question. I feel like it was an unexpected one. I didn't expect you to go down there, but
Western Europe. I was hoping it'd be Eastern Europe because that would have been much easier.
Would it?
I think so. But then you said it's also a Palme d'Or winning film you hadn't heard of.
It's the film. I shouldn't say I haven't heard of, but the film that won the Palme d'Or, it's not like his. I would say it's not even his like top 3 or top 5 most famous film or most known film.
So you're saying he made 5 or more films. That's more information. Okay. Let's see.
Tricky one.
It is tricky. I'm going through all these Palme d'Or winners, and it's like, whom would it not be? Whom would it be? And it's not this guy, because you said Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. You could try narrowing down the countries a bit more. That might...
I have 2 questions.
Well, I will say the guess is not part of the question, so technically you have 3.
Okay. I see. I was like...
Unless you just want to start naming people.
Okay, is the director French?
No.
So probably Italian or British, probably, but... I mean, there's other... I guess we've talked about Portuguese cinema, so maybe you... I don't see any Portuguese Palme d'Or winners. Okay, it's not that person. It's not Rossellini. It's not Fellini. It's not Visconti. Dang, the 1960 birth question was, I think, a little poorly judged. Should have been like 1940. All these Palme d'Or winners are so old.
If you're struggling, I can change the question to the 1940s one.
That's okay. I'll ask, are they British?
They're not British.
Oh, dang. Okay, that's 10. So I'll guess, and then we'll see what happens. Let's see.
Okay.
Yeah, I said the Palme d'Or question would give you work, but now I've gone through the list like three times.
I feel like it has messed you up because it's like I said, I never associated this person as like a Palme d'Or winner. I googled it and it caught me off guard. My instinct was to say that he hadn't.
Not French, not British, not for a well-known film of his. Wow, I'm really okay. I think I only have like one name, but I think this is kind of a well-known film, so I'm not at all confident.
You going for a guess?
Yeah. Is it Luis Buñuel?
It is Luis Buñuel.
Oh wow. Okay. I was struggling. I was really struggling to find someone. I think all that extra info was what did it, because if you just said Palme d'Or winner, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
I would
there's
say
a lot of people. Yeah,
a lot more candidates. But yeah, dang, tough one. At least I beat the machine. So
yeah, you beat the machine. Yeah, with some extra help, but yeah, you did.
Yeah, and I guess I survived for another podcast.
Yes, until we test you again, test your resolve.
Okay, let us end this mammoth-long episode. Should we quickly close with... can't speak anymore. Quickly close with a recommendation of some sort.
I just have a very simple one. We talked a lot about experimental films, so I thought might as well do an experimental film recommendation that I think is relatively easy to enjoy because it's really short, really fast, really... creative, so I just went for Bruce Conner's Cosmic Ray that I spoke about a bit more in the episode itself.
Right. And I also went with something experimental, but not a film. I went with a book. This is actually, it's a book about Brakhage. It's called Essential Brakhage, Selected Writings on Filmmaking by. So it's a really just a compilation of his writings, his interviews, things like that. And he's just has a really fascinating way with describing art and I guess perception, things like that. Is one of the most interesting writers and thinkers in film, I think. So yeah, great writing. Would highly recommend this book. It would maybe help people understand, quote unquote, his movies more, but I don't think that's necessary. Just kind of a good supplement.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we can close this out. I think we can end it here. So my name's Daniel. And thank you, Linus, my co-host, for joining me on this pretty epic episode about experimental film, which I hope we do more episodes on. So,
oh yes,
this will not be the last from us. So, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.